Good morning, my little YouTubers. Today we're going to talk about 4 words from Chapter 1 in Unit 1. And those 4 words are the Bronze Age, slash and burn agriculture, civilization, and cuneiform, or cuneiform. It can be pronounced a couple of different ways. So those 4 words are the center of today's talk. So let's begin. First off, we just got done talking about the Stone Age, Paleolithic and Neolithic Age, Stone Age, which lasted forever. And the Bronze Age, which is your first word, is the age directly following the Stone Age. So you could probably guess what characterized the Bronze Age. It was the metal bronze. But bronze wasn't a metal that's just found and discovered. So let's define Bronze Age. The Bronze Age was the time period from about 3000 BCE to about 1500 BCE, so about 1,500 years, where metalworking became significant and replaced stone tools. So that's kind of our definition. Metal replaces stone during the Bronze Age. So bronze is this metal that's created using a mixture of copper and usually tin, I think tin, to harden it a little bit. If you've ever worked with copper, just pure copper before, you know that copper is very flexible and malleable and bends really easily, and it doesn't stay in its shape. So if you had, like, say, a copper helmet or copper spear, they would be really easily bent. So bronze was a harder metal, and in order to create it, you had to actually melt down copper and tin, which you find in the earth, and then create this bronze. So bronze helped, the significance of, so what, why do we care? It allowed people to have more durable tools. It also allowed people to have more significant, sharp, and stronger weapons and armor. And so people were not only better at farming because of this as they moved into agricultural societies, but they also became better warriors. And a lot of groups who specialized in making weapons and used the bronze could easily overpower anybody who was just using essentially stone tools or stone-tipped spears and not much armor, maybe only leather for armor. So bronze is kind of a step up. If you were playing a game of Civilization, that would be your step up from leather and stone into bronze. The next step would be iron, but we'll talk about that later. So that's the Bronze Age. Slash and burn agriculture. As people started to become agricultural, this is our definition for slash and burn agriculture, they would clear land and burn all the wood or vegetation there and then use that land for farming. And that land would be good for 10 to 30 years before it kind of ran out of nutrients because of intensive farming, and then they could move on. So this is before people had really settled into permanent societies, but they were in the Neolithic Revolution and still had discovered agriculture. So what? The significance of this is kind of a transition type of agriculture between settled agriculture of the Neolithic age and then movement, nomadic peoples, or people who were hunters and gatherers from the earlier Stone Age. So they still could move with the land, and they still could pick a new place from time to time, but they could never set up huge civilizations or huge societies based on this type of agriculture because they had to continually move. And so it wasn't good for permanent civilizations, but it did allow for intense use of the land. And there's still societies in the world today that engage in slash and burn agriculture. So the next term is civilization, and this is probably the most loaded term that we have, and we're going to have a whole discussion about it. But the definition of civilization is usually people who have created a surplus of food due to farming and can therefore engage in more diverse activities. The second part of the definition is that they are usually settled in cities. So they are people who have mastered farming, they are settled in cities, and they have a surplus of food, which allows them to diversify. Now, historians are going to disagree about, so under that definition, there are some people who are really great societies, huge nomadic groups of people who would not be considered civilized, because they don't live in cities or they haven't mastered farming. So the idea is that civilized peoples came about at the end of the Neolithic period and created large societies. So what? What's the big deal? This is an interesting concept because civilization is kind of like the next step from societies who were just nomadic or hunting and gathering. And some scholars, some historians would argue that a true civilization not only has settled agriculture, surplus of food, and live in cities, but that they also have a written system, they have writing, so that they can read and write and transcribe more information, which then leads to a really complex or higher order political organization and allows them to expand to great numbers of people. So before civilized societies, there was no groups of people who were larger than a few thousand, but because of writing and settled agricultural and diversification, there was a huge degree of success in populating large areas. So we'll talk more about that term as well. The last term today is cuneiform, or as my history professors in college would call it, cuneiform, which both of it is fine. But I'll stick with cuneiform because for some reason it sounds okay to me. So cuneiform is kind of the first known system of writing that we have historical records of. And cuneiform was simply, the definition of it is the first type of writing, and it was wedged shaped sticks that were pressed into wet clay, and that clay would harden. So you can imagine that all of this, and the so what's the big deal? First of all, it wasn't a very complex system of writing. It was mostly just for record keeping, and it was very cumbersome, meaning it's not really difficult. Imagine if you had to take notes or write down a note on a tablet of clay pressed wet into the clay, and then you dry it out. It doesn't work very well for everything. It's not very movable. It's not very what am I trying to say? Convenient for people to use. So it was definitely the precursor for other types of writing, and it was important because when you have writing, you're able to have a more complex and a more sophisticated form of government and record keeping for the most part. So it led to other types of writing. It did indeed lead to alphabetic types of writing, which then were easier to put onto, as later people in history would invent paper and ink. They could then easily transcribe this stuff. So the significance of writing is pretty cool because people didn't come born to write. We are born to make language and speak. But language, when it's written down, is an invention that is a pretty significant invention in human history. So probably one of the most significant human inventions. All right, that's 8 minutes, so that's enough for these 4 words. I'll see you next time. Don't forget to be awesome.